Now, for a breakdown of the 2022 presidential election and what to expect under the new administration, we are joined on the line by Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo, Head of International Relations at King's College London. Great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for making time at this very difficult and demanding time. First of all, normally, does an election turnout that's massive reflect support or an approval or disappointment and a need for change usually? And what's the case for South Korea this time?
Well, we have seen, first of all, an election with a very high turnout, almost the same as the last election, in which the electorate has decided by the thinnest, by the smallest of margins. So I think to an extent this shows obviously that there is a division between Koreans, left and right wing Koreans. But on the other hand, I think it also shows that for many centrist voters, any of the two options would have done. It seems that up to 1/4 of former Moon Jae-in voters have voted this time for Yoon Suk-yeol, so they have changed parties. But also we assume that many conservative voters have actually decided to vote for a liberal candidate. So in a sense, it seems that there are many voters who are not as polarized as we thought and who think that any of the two candidates was equally good from their perspective.
In your opinion, what would be the decisive factor in becoming a strong critic of the Moon Jae-in government?
I think so. I think there are voters who are critical of the Moon Jae-in government. This tends to happen with any governing party, it has to be said, and not only in Korea, but outside of Korea. I guess there are some voters who think that he didn't deliver on the promises on which he was elected in 2017. I think there is also COVID fatigue among some voters who, even though Korea has had a good response to the pandemic, but they feel that maybe the restrictions should have been removed sooner, and we have seen this actually in elections in other countries as well. And I think, of course, there are voters who are concerned about housing prices, about how the way the economy is going, maybe about their own job prospects, and they blame the incumbent party and the incumbent president for these issues.
What would be your assessment of the North Korea policies of the Moon Jae-in government? There were some critics of the government in terms of that aspect. And what will be the direction forward for the coming administration and the expectations of the people in terms of cross-border ties?
I think it is fair to say that some South Koreans have been critical of the engagement policy of President Moon. They believe that he has spent too much time on this issue, but we should also be clear that this hasn't really been the main issue throughout the campaign. It has been more about the economics, some gender issues as well, and there has been some discussion about North Korea, but it seems that very few voters have voted in taking into consideration this North Korea policy. I would assume that Yoon is going to take a tougher stance towards North Korea. I would assume that he's going to be more critical, for example, of nuclear tests or the human rights record of North Korea. But he has also made clear that if there is an opportunity for engagement between the two Koreas, between the US, North Korea, and South Korea on a trilateral basis, he's going to pursue it. So I think to an extent we have to wait and see what the reaction of North Korea is going to be once June takes office in a couple of months, because the US is open to dialogue. The Biden administration has made this clear, and President-elect Yoon has said that he will do need to engage. So I think really the ball now is on North Korea's court. We have to see if he's willing to engage, or otherwise we will see criticism, deterrence, sanctions from South Korea and from the international community.
Speaking of the ball being on someone's court, when it comes to the economy, we've saw some disappointing numbers in terms of the employment figures and key figures related to the economy here in South Korea. What were some of the possible shortcomings in the Moon Jae-in administration, and what will be the expectations for the incoming administration in terms of the changes they might implement to turn things around?
If we look at unemployment in South Korea, it has remained more or less stable, the unemployment rate and the youth unemployment rate, really since the Asian financial crisis. But clearly many Koreans think that South Korea should be doing better. So I think there is going to be an expectation that the incoming administration is going to find ways to promote especially private sector permanent employment as opposed to temporary. And I think if you look at the income inequality in South Korea has been decreasing, but wealth inequality has been increasing over the past few years. So I think that there's going to be a heavy focus by voters, by the South Korean electorate, on first of all, stabilizing housing prices because they have been going up dramatically over the past few years. But secondly, also finding ways of decreasing this wealth inequality, which is especially pronounced between younger South Koreans and older South Koreans whose wealth far exceeds those of people in their 20s and even their 30s.
Battling the pandemic has been a very fatiguing issue for the nation and the economy as well. What about the quarantine measures? There were some praise during the early stages, with K-quarantine being a major pride factor for South Korea, but then it took a dive recently, and some of the measures that were taken, they were considered too harsh for certain small businesses. So there's been a little back and forth in terms of the policy and the measures that's being implemented. Of course, this being the first time we're experiencing something as big as the COVID-19 pandemic, it's understandable. But what would you advise the incoming administration to focus on in terms of the measure that's tighter, or allowing more breathing room for living with COVID-19, or allowing a greater ease of businesses to continue what they're supposed to do?
I think it's going to be interesting to see the next 2 months because, of course, Moon will still be the president until May. And I think there is this push among South Koreans to remove the current restrictions. Of course, small and medium-sized enterprises, businesses, they think that they should have been removed sooner. But now we also see consumers who, to an extent, have moved on. And now they want to have an economy that is fully open. They want businesses to be able to operate as before the pandemic. So it could be interesting that by the time June takes office, many of the restrictions have been removed, including, for example, for traveling overseas and coming back to South Korea. In any case, I would expect by the time June takes office in May, if there are still some remaining restrictions, I would expect him to move quite quickly to remove them, because we have seen this in many other countries after the Omicron peak that South Korea is under now, and will probably continue for a few more days in March. And we have seen other countries that after the peak, governments have been very quick in removing remaining restrictions, because we shouldn't forget, South Korea, of course, has done very well in dealing with the pandemic, much better than other countries, but there's also the mental health issue. And I think many Koreans, like many people really in the rest of the world, they have this fatigue from the pandemic, and they really want to go back to the normal that we had before this started a couple of years ago.
Right, we do count the days until when we could be out there without masks and feel natural about that. This is the only second election here in South Korea since the impeachment changed the date for picking a new leader. What are some of the key differences compared to the last elections?
I think, in my view, there are two key differences. The first one is that, of course, in the previous one, it was obvious that the Liberals were going to win. There was a huge discontent with President Park during the impeachment process. And now what we have seen in this election is that there are those who are unhappy with the government, but then we shouldn't forget that the popularity of Moon Jae-in remains around 45%. So there are also who are happy with his 5 years of government. So this division that we have seen throughout this campaign that has led to a fairly bitter campaign that many people have disliked because of the personal attacks was very different, of course, 2017 when we didn't see this same division. And I think the second issue, which is quite important in my view, is that South Korea itself has changed. South Korea has become much more prominent at the global level. And I think South Koreans are keenly aware of the role that their country plays in international issues, how this affects South Korea itself. So some of the discussions that we have seen, for example, about gender issues, there has been this comparison between South Korea and other developed countries. But even if we look at foreign policy, these discussions that we have seen about how to deal with China, how to deal with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, these type of issues that South Koreans see themselves as since the country has been developed along with many other countries, they compare themselves among the developed countries, and they want to their country to maybe behave in a different way or treat certain issues in a different way because they think they're not a developing country anymore, they're a developed country, so this type of issues should be dealt with in a way that wasn't the case in the past. And I don't think we saw this in 2017 as much as we have seen this time around.
The public is deeply engaged and immersed and interested in everything, the intricacies of the election process from the get-go. Even during the primaries, a lot of people are voicing their approval or disapproval of the way it's being shaped and the way the candidates are being chosen. How much of a pros or cons are there in terms of the extreme immersive, inclusiveness and engagement from the people with the politicians in terms of the process?
I think that's an excellent question. It has been very interesting to see the extent that, as you said, going back to the primaries, this has been going on 4 months. Voters took a keen interest in the policies, of course, of the candidates, but also on personal life, how they have behaved in the past. In the case of Juno, of course, his past as a prosecutor. So I think that the interest of the South Korean electorate has been really amazing to see, because you don't see this level of engagement in many other democracies, especially mature democracies. For example, over 70% of voters going to the polls, people with COVID going to the polls, and in other countries, really, they have decided to stay home. So I think this shows the level of engagement, but it also increases the level of scrutiny over the candidates in a way that I think is positive, but there are, of course, many critics who think that there's too much scrutiny, for example, on family issues and personal issues that they believe shouldn't be the deciding factor when casting the vote. So I think that's something to take into consideration as well, that the level of scrutiny might be good, but of course there are critics who say, okay, why don't we focus on the policies per se and we forget about other factors that they think are secondary. And this is in contrast with other countries in which, for example, it is very difficult to know the personal life of the candidates. You simply don't know about it. It's not an issue. But in Korea it is. So candidates are treated more.
All right, Professor Pacheco Pardo, unfortunately, we're going to have to cut our conversation short because we need to focus on the site where the president-elect has arrived to deliver a speech. So we hope to continue our conversation at a different time, hopefully, to pick your brains a little bit further. Professor Pacheco Pardo, thank you so much for making time for us and providing us with your insights. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.